Hello and welcome to Dining with Death. This episode is on my playlist, Dining with the Deceased, where we visit locations that are supposedly haunted. I'm going to take you on a little tour of the cemetery, and then of course we're going to eat in the area. I'm Stacy Lee. Let's begin.
They say you die twice, once when you die and once when your name is last spoken. I would imagine that if you're buried in a spectacular place like this, you don't have to worry about your name never being spoken again, because every year thousands of people come to this place to remember those who came before us and passed long before we were a twinkle in our parents' eye. This is Lone Fir Cemetery. It sits in the heart of Portland, Oregon, and it's not just a cemetery. It is Portland's second largest arboretum with hundreds of towering trees, some of them more than 100 years old. It is one of Oregon's most important and most treasured historical places because so many founders are buried here. Lone Fir's first occupant was Emmer Stevens. He was buried here in 1846 when the cemetery was first named Mount Crawford. We're going to visit his grave later on. The cemetery was renamed Lone Fir in 1866 after the then one solitary tree that still stands in the northwest corner. This is one of Portland's oldest cemeteries and, like I said, has become an arboretum with more than 700 trees living here and representing 67 species, watching over the 25,000 people who are buried here. There are so many uniquely carved headstones here, all kinds of shapes and sizes. There are obelisks and spires and scrolls, and these more modern stones with the photos of the deceased on them. I love this one with the moss growing in every crack. Look at this amazing headstone with brilliant color. This man was a well-known bike racer here in Portland. I love this stone that says, "Gone home to horsepower heaven." Look at this beauty with an arch carved over the top. Very stately and Victorian looking, isn't it? With its two pillars holding up the arch. And again, the moss almost looks like it's placed intentionally. It's so perfect, but this is just Oregon. It's very green and very wet. Look at the ornate carving on this one. The stonework is simply stunning. I don't even know how you begin to create something like this, but it's very impressive. The trees. Oh my gosh, the trees. The trunks are massive, but the canopies are even more impressive. They spread over whole sections of the cemetery and provide not only shade, but such a beautiful atmosphere. The vibes here are just immaculate. I could absolutely lay down here under one of these beauties and take one of those long, heavy naps that makes you feel like you've slept for a week. Just listening to the rustling leaves and the wind blowing on your face. You know, those kinds of naps, they're the best. This is one of the more unusual monuments I've seen in my years of cemetery exploring. It's a large block of concrete with multiple names written in marble. It looks to have been designed with this little overhang to protect the marble engravings. And then over on the left is this little alcove with very old-looking headstones inside. Actually, a really good idea to protect them. Kind of looks like the marble engravings are newer, perhaps even newer than the last people buried here. And then they incorporated those very old tombstones from the early 1900s. Don't you love the old engravings on these beautiful old markers? I even love the patina on the concrete behind them with its texture and rusty orange moss growing on it. Just so beautiful. I found this marker to be especially stunning. It's something you'd see in a film or a painting. It's massive in size and quite ornate. It is the marker of John H. Thessing's grave, born in 1819. He died in 1895. The way the moss has grown on it, oh my gosh, just gorgeous. There are quite a few headstones that read woodman, which is a term I wasn't really familiar with. A woodman is a person who works in the woods as a forester or woodcutter. A lot of the headstones have the initials MWA on them, which stands for Modern Woodmen of America. This tombstone says Woodmen of the World, which is an organization that focuses on providing burials and gravestones for all of its members. This being Oregon, there are a lot of woodmen in this area, and many of the early workers are buried here. Look at the detail on this marker. It's stunning. It really looks like wood, like the bark of a tree, but it is, in fact, solid stone. There is some serious craftsmanship in this cemetery, and I was particularly impressed with this one. It was nice to see a family in their cultural attire visiting the grave of a loved one. I obviously didn't want to intrude or invade their privacy, but it was really beautiful to watch them light incense and kneel at the gravesite of their loved one. Really touching and really special. Then we got to the headstone marking the grave of someone with a very fascinating story. This is the resting place of Anne Jean Tingry-Lacaze. She was a prostitute here in Portland. She was born in France in 1850, and on December 2nd, 1885, when she was 35 years old, she was murdered on 3rd Street in Portland. Anne Jean used the name of Emma Merlotten as a courtesan. Her husband had run off with another woman and left Anne with no money when she was young. So she became a very high-class escort and was making great money. She was famous for her beauty, and some of Portland's most influential businessmen employed her services. She held garden parties and invited the area women, and these parties were the talk of the town. I always laugh when people say our society is moralless and crumbling. People who say things like that don't know anything about history. Sex work was demonized in the 1950s. Before that, it was a totally and completely acceptable job in most people's eyes. And there are a lot of very famous and influential prostitutes throughout history. On the night of Anne Jean/Emma's murder, an especially cold night just before Christmas, she was at home in her cottage on 3rd Street. A police officer nearby heard a woman screaming. He followed the screams to Emma's home, where he found her partially under the bed. She had been hacked more than 12 times with a hatchet. The police noticed a man watching at the crime scene, and he had scratches all over his face. His name was William Sudstrom, but he denied being the killer. The police were never able to put a case together on him, and to this day, Anne Jean, Emma, her murder is unsolved. But what I find most fascinating is a very gruesome story about what happened after her death. According to lore, at the time, scientists believed that images were stored in the eyeballs of the deceased. So after her murder, Anne Jean's eyeballs were removed to be examined in hopes that an image of her killer would be found in them. Isn't that fascinating? Quite interesting to learn that they really believed the eyeballs functioned as a camera, and quite a grotesque form of investigation. In the heart of the cemetery sits this absolutely stunning building. You can see it from all angles, and when you get closer to it, you realize it's very large. It's tall. This is the Maclay family mausoleum. Donald Maclay was a prominent banker and merchant in Portland. He was the partner of William Corbett, and together they established a very successful shipping and trading business. Donald was the founder of the U.S. National Bank of Portland. During the Panic of 1893, this bank survived because Donald loaned it large sums of his own money. Donald married Martha McCulloch in 1869, and they had 3 daughters, Barbara, Edith, and Mabel. This mausoleum was built in 1877 for the cost of $13,500. That is more than $500,000 in today's money. The building is made of sandstone that is covered in a facade of higher-grade sandstone. Originally, there were stained glass windows, but at some point, no one is really sure when, those stained glass windows were removed, probably to be sold, and they were replaced with painted replicas that haven't held up very well. You can see how faded they are, and you can also clearly see that the leaded portions are not actually lead. The whole thing is surrounded by a fence, and there are signs on it warning people to stay back. Apparently, from time to time, a chunk of sandstone falls off of the roof of the mausoleum, and if one of those hit you, you'd be in big trouble. What I wouldn't give to get in there and go down those old steps past that gateway. It would be really amazing to take a look around inside, wouldn't it? I love the castle-like design and the carved spires on each corner and the way it kind of looms over you as you stand at the base. It's beautiful and kind of spooky and dreadful all at once. Some of these stones are so old that you can't read what's on them anymore, or you can barely read it. I know some might find this morbid, but I would love to open some of these graves and look at the clothing of the time, what would be left of it anyway. I find clothing from eras past to be so fascinating. It's such a personal item and something we don't get to see very often. We see old buildings and old photos, but we rarely get to see the actual items of clothing worn by people from decades past. And yes, I would really enjoy seeing what some of these folks are wearing as their forever outfit. This gorgeous monument is the marker for the grave of Alice Oberly. Alice was another very famous prostitute, what was then called a fancy lady, who took over 6,000 lovers in her lifetime. Her sister Flora worked as her madam, and together they made a very good living. When Alice died in 1884 of cirrhosis of the liver, her customers purchased her this beautiful headstone. It used to have an inscription on it, but in the years after her death, her family members had it removed because they didn't want their name to be tied to a prostitute. I think that's terrible, but boy, it sure is a gorgeous piece of stonework, isn't it? Just incredible. It looks like something in a Tim Burton film. I love it. This is the headstone of Samuel L. Simpson, a famous poet. Sam Simpson is described as a singer of love songs to Oregon. I read one opinion that said, what Edgar Allan Poe was to the beginning of the century, Sam Simpson was to the end of it. He is most famous for his poem entitled Beautiful Willamette, part of which goes, onward ever, lovely river, softly calling to the sea, time that scars us, maims and mars us, leaves no track or trench of thee. Sam Simpson also wrote stories about Oregon, and when he died, he was given a prominent place in this historic cemetery. This corner of the cemetery is dedicated to the Chinese immigrants who helped build Portland's infrastructure. Originally, it was intended to be a temporary burial plot for those awaiting a trip back to China for burial there. But as the years passed, many of the dead were forgotten, so the city purchased this parcel and reserved it as a resting place for all of those with no one else to claim them. Then, the insane asylum nearby began burying its dead patients in the plot as well. Dr. James C. Hawthorne, we're going to visit his grave in a moment, often paid for these burials himself. He was known to be a kind and compassionate doctor and did a lot for the early city of Portland. In the 1940s, a project was started to disinter all of the Chinese immigrants' remains and make sure they found family members in China. And in 1948, that mission was complete. There were plans to begin using that portion of the cemetery, but then concerns were raised that perhaps not all of the immigrants had been disinterred. So plans were halted. As of now, it sits barren, without headstones and most likely some forgotten metal boxes containing human remains underneath. I loved this marker. This is the tomb of two brothers, George Michael Bottler and George Frederick Bottler, and they were the first beer brewers in Oregon. Now, if this right here doesn't tell you how much Portland loves its beer, I don't know what will. These brothers were so beloved that the city paid for this tomb for them when they died in the 1860s. I found this to be such a quintessential Portland moment. I just love it. It's really crumbling, and efforts are underway to restore it and make sure it lasts another 200 years. One of the oldest blocks of the cemetery is raised up a bit, and there are these little old steps you take to get to it. The area has some of the oldest markers and some of the most unique. This one is famous in the world of tombstones. It's a little scary looking. The eyes are black holes, but I actually find it really sweet. Imagine loving your sweetheart so much that you want to be remembered like this, as a little old couple holding hands for eternity. I find it just tender and endearing, even if it is a little creepy. People leave pennies on the collars, and someone has even made a little crown of flowers for her head. So sweet. Look at this unusual marker. It reads, "We lie here by consent, after 52 years, 2 months, and 2 days sojourning through life, awaiting nature's immutable laws to return us back to the elements of the universe of which we were first composed." Wow, that is quite the tombstone engraving, right? This is the gravesite of Dr. James B. Hawthorne that I told you about earlier. He founded and ran the Hospital for the Insane. Unlike a lot of stories from this era, this doctor was more compassionate and seemed to care about his patients, even the most mentally ill. He not only founded the first insane asylum, but also helped finance early bridges around Portland, and that assisted in the development of the shipping industry here. He died of a brain hemorrhage and lies next to his infant daughter. And now we have arrived at the grave of the very first occupant of Lone Fir Cemetery, Emmer Stevens. As we filmed, my husband said, "This is just wild. We're looking at the grave of someone who saw and lived through the Revolutionary War." It's really quite amazing when you think about it. This cemetery is said to be one of the most haunted places in Oregon. On April 8, 1854, one of the worst steamboat disasters in history occurred here in Portland. Workers were loading freight onto a ship called the Gazelle when its boilers exploded, killing 24 people and injuring 30 others. Colburn Barrell, the steamboat's owner, bought a large plot here in the cemetery to bury the dead killed in the accident, and some of them are said to roam the grounds of the cemetery. People report whispers in their ears when they are here alone. They report feeling a cold wind brush by them or through them, even on hot summer days. Anne Jean Tingry Lacaze, or Emma Merlotten, who we spoke of earlier, is said to inhabit this place. Visitors claim they have seen her, dressed in Victorian clothing, walking amongst the trees, but when they call to her, she vanishes. Several visitors claim they have seen this ghost carrying the hatchet with which she was murdered, and some claim to hear her screams, much like those the police officer heard coming from her house on the night of her gruesome death. People claim to have seen Chinese immigrants dressed in cultural clothing from bygone eras, wandering the grounds as if they are lost, wondering why they are here and not in their native China. Many visitors have reported white mist that seems to rise from the ground into the form of a silhouette that then disappears. One woman claims she saw a young girl walking through the oldest part of the cemetery holding a doll, looking around as though she was trying to find someone, and others claim to have heard crying. I had my husband leave me alone for about 30 minutes so I could just sit in silence, hoping that something would happen for me. I didn't hear a voice or feel a cold breeze, but I did feel very peaceful and very much not alone here. You know I'm a skeptical person, but I believe that if any place on earth is haunted, it could very well be Lone Fir Cemetery, one of the most beautiful cemeteries in America. Now, as we always do on this playlist, we eat in our haunted location. This is Dining with Death. Portland has so many fabulous places to eat, but it's well known for its food truck culture. So we decided to eat here at Cartopia, which is Portland's original food truck park. There are smoothies and vegan dishes, Egyptian food, and tacos. We chose to eat at Bottle Rocket. We're in Portland, so you know we had to try a locally brewed beer, and it was so hot on this day that we also ordered fresh squeezed lemonade that was so good. The beers here in Portland are outstanding, by the way. The park has tables in the center with plenty of seating and some planters as well. We ordered cheeseburgers. Jason had his with tempura cauliflower and jalapenos as a side, and I ordered the chili flake green beans. The burgers were so good, kind of a smash burger, tender and juicy, on really good bread that was soft on the inside with a nice crust. The side dishes were spicy and perfectly crisp. These green beans made me feel a little better about having a beer and a burger. We loved this place. The whole food truck vibe is great. It is quintessential Portland, a little eclectic, a little kooky, and as always, very beautiful and very historic, just like Lone Fir Cemetery, such a beautiful place that it seems some of its residents have decided to stay here forever.
Thanks for joining me today on Dining with Death, Dining with the Deceased. Like the video if you liked the video, and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to support me. You can also join my Patreon. Stay safe and be kind to each other, and I'll see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.